In the blink of an eye, the world changed forever.
El gobierno dará a conocer en las próximas horas una serie de medidas sanitarias y económicas para seguir enfrentando la
cuenta una reunión con el presidente y el jefe de gobierno.
A global crisis of unprecedented proportions, from which no country has escaped. In Latin America, we have faced many challenging times, some more difficult than others. But today, we all understand that solidarity is our biggest strength. "50 years ago, CAF was created with a mission. 5 Andean countries united to promote sustainable development and regional integration, thus improving quality of life and boosting productivity. Today, we are composed by 19 countries and account for over 600 million people. And despite the distance and the barriers that separate us, we must work more united than ever, because only together we will succeed. The world will not be the same, but now we have the opportunity to build an even better one, a more harmonious, cleaner, and efficient planet. And for the challenges that lie ahead, at CAF, we want to say 3 words. Here we are. To build together a region of opportunities, especially for the most vulnerable ones, with infrastructure that improves quality of life and increases connectivity. A region of vibrant cities, of entrepreneurs and businesses committed to their communities, of societies respectful with the natural world that we all share and must care for. At CAF, we have walked along a region for 50 years on its road to progress. Now more than ever, here we are. And here we will remain, firm in our commitment of being the development bank of Latin America.
Good morning to all of you. It's my pleasure to join you this morning. I'm Andrea Bernal on behalf of CAF, Latin American Development Bank. It's my pleasure to say hello to all of you, to welcome you to this event, Keys to Rethink the Present and the Future of Latin America. We have Luis Carranza, the Executive President of CAF, Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Laureate of Economy, Ángel Huilla, OECD General Secretary, Arisina Baxena, ECLAC General Secretary, Enrique Iglesias, the Ibero-American Secretary. I say hello to all of you. Thank you for joining us, for your company and for your time. This event is framed in the week of celebrations due to the 50th anniversary of CAF. It started its operations on June the 8th, 1970, and ever since it's been charged with accompanying its shareholder countries in efforts to reach prosperity, sustainable development, and inclusion for all citizens. CAF has always been present in complex situations with a view to supplement the effort developed by countries in the region in order to face all sorts of challenges. The sanitary and economic crisis generated by COVID-19 is not an exception, nor will it be. I'd like to ask you to share your opinions on the media, hashtag CAF50, at Agenda CAF. We are in Facebook, in Instagram, and in Twitter. We are broadcasting in English, in Spanish, and in Portuguese, and originally at www.caf.com. El País from España, GBA from Argentina, La Nación, El Tiempo, O Globo from Brazil, El Comercio from Peru, El Comercio from Ecuador, El País de Uruguay, El Mercurio from Chile, El Universal from Mexico, El Nacional from Venezuela, La Nación from Costa Rica, Graphic Print from El Salvador, La Prensa from Panama, América Economía, La Razón from Bolivia, Cinco Días from Paraguay, and The Guardian from Trinidad and Tobago are the media joining us. We all are ready to get started. I'd like to welcome Luis Carranza Ugarte, the Executive President of CAF, who will share his remark. Thank you for your time and welcome. Good morning. Thank you very much, Andrea. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the CAF conference in the framework of our 50th anniversary celebration. CAF started its operations in 1970. On that year, Latin America represented 5.5% of international trade, and it accounted for 7.3% of the global GDP. 50 years down the road, Latin America represents 5.6% of global trade and 7.4% of global GDP. If we take a look at relative terms, our situation against to the United States, the per capita GDP of Latin America represented in 1970 25% of the per capita GDP that the United States represented at that time. 50 years later, with data from the last few years, we have to say that Latin America represents 27.8%. That's quite different from the experience in other regions or in other countries where they managed to have interesting convergence with the United States, as is the case, for instance, with South Korea. For the same period of time, they represented 8.5% of United States per capita GDP up to close to 65%. This feeling of stagnation largely varies if we take a look at it on a decade basis, and the situation of countries also changes. We've had countries with interesting growth processes and other countries that have had setbacks. But as a region, I should say, we have a problem we have to deal with. We have infrastructure gaps to overcome. We have low levels of integrations that we have not yet solved. We continue to be the more inequitable region in the world. In the last few decades, it's true we've had major breakthroughs, especially when it comes to social indicators. Unfortunately, so many of these breakthroughs are jeopardized at the current crisis we are going through. For that reason, it is important to reflect upon the challenges. which policies are necessary to improve productivity and reduce inequality in a permanent basis? How can we approach an integration agenda based on logistical corridors and on regional value chains rather than on political affinities among countries? How can we go about generating tax spaces to approach and close the infrastructure gap our region has in the planet? These are relevant topics, but it is even more relevant than detailing the agenda is to say how we can better find internal mechanisms in each country in order to look for the agreements that will allow us to have a minimum agenda for the region. This is relevant. It is important, therefore, to count on the presence of Joseph Stiglitz, who will address us with his remark, and also to thank the presence of Alicia Bárcena, the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, Ángel Burría, the General Secretary of OECD, and of Enrique Iglesias, the former General Secretary for Iberoamerican and the former IDB President, so they can share their ideas and their views on the challenges of Latin America. I'd like to conclude by thanking all of you for participating with us in this conference. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to thank Luis Carranza for sharing his reflections this morning and for opening the meeting we have. No doubt it's shaped differently. We rethink and we renew ourselves, and this is what is happening today. I'd like to give the floor to Joseph Stiglitz now, the Nobel Laureate of Economy in 2001, professor of the Columbia University. Professor Stiglitz studied in the Amherst College and in the University of Chicago. He got his PhD at MIT in 1969 down to 1970 when CAF was started its operations. He was a Fulbright investigator in Cambridge. The next year, he taught at Yale, at Tuck, at Stanford, and in Princeton. Additionally to his numerous contributions to microeconomy, Professor Stiglitz has worked in the administration Clinton. He talked about the economic role in the White House. He was the economy-in-chief between 1997 and the year 2000. He's been one of the key authors on the group of experts of climate change. He was given the award by the Bank of Switzerland in the year 2001 because of his analysis of markets and information. Together with all this, he can now take the floor. Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. We give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here to participate in your celebration of your 50th anniversary. Your bank has shown the contributions that a development bank can make to development. It's very interesting to see that your bank has had a higher credit rating than its member countries, and that means you are able to provide finance capital to invest in critical investment needs and infrastructure and other areas at a lower cost of capital than otherwise would have been possible. Let me spend a few minutes talking about the broader importance of development banks. 25 years ago, when I arrived at the World Bank, under the influence of neoliberalism, a set of ideas about markets being able to solve all problems, development banks were looked at with some skepticism. The irony was that even the World Bank took this view, even though the World Bank was itself a development bank. The general perspective was leave it to the market. Well, economic theory, even before that, had explained why you cannot always leave it to the market, had explained the limitations to the market. And since then, with the financial crisis of 2008, with the multiple financial crises in countries around the world, we now understand much better the limits of the market. Now, let me talk about a few of those limits. First, there's a need for industrial policy. Even the World Bank now recognizes that. In fact, under one of my successors as chief economist of the World Bank, Justin Lin, that was one of the major thrusts of the World Bank. Industrial policy addresses the large number of ever-present market failures, which is especially important when there has been too limited efforts to correct some of the market failures. The obvious example right now is climate change. The world is facing an existential threat with climate change, and there have been inadequate efforts around the world to deal with it, even though there's been a global agreement in Paris committing the world to address the issue. There's a recognition that the commitments made at Paris are not sufficient, and one has to incentivize, motivate, finance both the public and the private sector to take stronger action. And the provision of finance is particularly important, and that's where the development banks come in. A second example is developmental spillover. Even advanced countries now recognize that there can be important spillovers from one sector to another. The development of the internet, supported by the U.S. government, has ushered in an era of technical change from which we've all benefited. We could not have been able to respond to the COVID-19 crisis in the way we have if there hadn't been those advances. Advances in researching science and biology have enabled us, again, to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, to develop vaccines, to therapeutics, again, supported by government research efforts, which have developed a vibrant biomedical sectors. It's not a question, as some people used to say, of picking winners, though government has done a very credible job of picking winners, far better than the private sector has often done. But it's identifying externalities and other market failures. And that's the function of development banks and industrial policy. A third area, which is absolutely essential, are distribution. The pandemic, COVID-19, has brought home very forcefully the inequities and inequalities in our society. This disease is not an equal opportunity disease. It goes after most virulently those who have pre-existing conditions, those who are most exposed because of the nature of their work. And these are overwhelmingly, disproportionately, those of lower income. It is one of the reasons why I think there is an outpouring in the United States for more action to deal with the injustices, the social injustices, including the racial injustices, have become so manifest. My own research showed the bias towards labor-saving capital investments, towards labor-saving innovations. These in turn lead to lower wages and higher unemployment. And these biases have been worsened by government policy in the post-crisis 2008 crisis world, with lower capital costs for large firms, higher capital costs for others. What we need recognize is both the level and the design of investments in a wide arena has been very badly distorted. So that lays out the problems in the development strategies and why government has an important role to play. But private finance is at the center of many of these market distortions. The private banking system, private financial system is short-term. The irony is that many of the investors are long-term, and many of the investment needs are long-term. But in between stand short-term financial markets. And again, this is precisely one of the key roles of development banks, to have a long-run perspective, taking into account the disparity between social and private returns. Even in developed countries like the United States, we are now recognizing the importance of development banks, of green banks. Here in New York, where I live, there's been established a Green Development Bank, which is playing a very important role in helping us respond to the challenges of climate change. The problem is not only that the private markets lend too little in certain areas, they often lend too much in others. They have incentives to get countries over-indebted. Worse, when the inevitable happens, there's a debt crisis, the private sector tries to strangle the countries in an irrational way, which is not only inhumane, but actually undermines their recovery, what they get. The creditors have opposed the development of a good, humane, and rational framework for debt restructuring. In 2015, the UN General Assembly adopted a set of principles, but a few of the major creditor countries, including the United States, refused. They believed that in the principle of the exertion of brute power, they were short-sighted in lending. They failed to do prudential oversight, and they are now short-sighted in their approaches that they take to restructuring. It used to be the case that the IMF acted as a creditor collection agency, but more recently, they no longer are doing that. They have undertaken a globally responsible role. They've said, making it very clear that debt restructurings need to be sustainable. In the past, the private sector debt restructurings typically were not sustainable. Within 5 years, half the countries that had restructurings were back into a crisis. So we now understand the principles of sustainability. We now understand what are the limits of debt restructuring, how it should be done. But unfortunately, the short-sighted private sector is not going along. We're seeing this very vividly in the ongoing dispute with Argentina. Argentina, as it's approached the problem of debt restructuring, has played a very constructive role, working with the IMF, defining sustainabilities, developing models where one can assess that. And again, unfortunately, we're once again seeing the failure of the private sector. One has to ask, what is the reason that the private sector has been so inhumane, so flawed, not only in its lending, but in its restructuring? And there's a lot of debate about that. I think it's perhaps a reflection of the organizational failures. The individuals within the organization have a short-term perspective reflecting the short-term nature of the financial markets that I commented on a few minutes ago. What we see is that this kind of short-termism is being reflected in the debt negotiations with Argentina, with some of the creditors demanding money that is clearly beyond what is sustainable. I could put it very frankly, they're shameless. What is so ironic, some even pretend to be good corporate citizens, recognizing the importance of a long-term perspective. But while they talk the talk, they don't walk the walk. This then is a third fundamental way, besides correcting market failures and looking towards the long term, between development banks and private banks. The latter is based on exploitation, deriving as much profit as possible, the welfare of the country be damned. The former is based on positive values of cooperation and partnership in the way that CAF has demonstrated so well over the past half century. Your bank has been a model for the entire world. Your success in this past 50 years has inspired efforts at creating development banks elsewhere. It has also inspired among academics research to understand why development banks can and do make such an important contribution. The 2008 and COVID-19 crises have made us more aware of the limitations of markets, more aware of the need for good public institutions, and the need for regional and global cooperation. You are emblematic of success in that area, and out as a beacon in these troubled times. Thank you.
Mr. Stiglitz, thank you very much for attending this conference, for enlightening us with your words in these moments that Latin America is trying to rethink what is going to happen with not only the health or the education, but the economic standards. I want you to ask you just one question before we leave you. In Latin America, there is a huge infrastructure gap. We estimate that the region needs to invest around 6% of its annual GDP to address this gap. How can development banks such as CAF Fellow can help?
Oh, they're absolutely essential, because one of the problems in making those investments is access to resources. Another problem is access to the technology, to the expertise necessary to make sure that the investments are well designed, really meet the needs of the country and meet regional needs at the same time. And the development banks do both of those. They bring the expertise, which is absolutely essential. They also bring finance at a lower cost than the countries individually, or even the regions or municipalities would be able to do. So by bringing together both expertise, professionalism, and lower cost finance, they will enable Latin America to better meet these huge infrastructure needs that you just pointed out.
Mr. Stiglitz, thanks again for being here. Thanks for your time. Joseph E. Stiglitz, an American economist, you all know, with a Nobel Prize in Economy. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Vamos a dar paso, luego de agradecerle nuevamente al...
We'll give the floor, after thanking Professor Stiglitz, to our colleagues here. Before that, I'd like to invite you all who are connected from all over the place around the world. I'd like to thank you for your time to share questions that we will be asking towards the end of the session on our social media. You can write at CAF Agenda in Twitter under the hashtag CAF50, and you can then send over all your questions so you can all get connected. Without any further ado, we are ready. I'll present you to our distinguished panel, consisting of Alicia Bárcena. She currently is the Executive Secretary of ECLAC. Alicia, welcome. Thank you. Ángel Gurría, the General Secretary of OECD. Thank you, Secretary. Enrique Iglesias, the former General Secretary of Iberoamerica and the former Chairman of IDB. Thank you for your time. I'd like to get started with an initial round for each one of you. You'll have 4 or 5 minutes, and I wish we can have it short and dynamic so we can then have the questions from our audience today. Ms. Bárcena, I'll get started with you. How do you see the evolution of Latin America and the Caribbean? Thank you. I'd like to congratulate Luis Carranza and CAF on your 50th anniversary. Thank you for inviting me. How do we take the crisis? We don't want to have another lost decade. This can take us back 13 years ago. And what we are facing today is decades long of privatization and commodification of healthcare services in our region, fragmentation of healthcare services. We are at the tip of the pandemic. We really don't know what will happen. We have lots of gaps, structural gaps that we've been dragging along. Just imagine the public expenditure in healthcare has not exceeded 2% of the GDP in the last few decades. So we are faced with a situation with great structural challenges. What are we concerned with? That we can leave this crisis more in debt, poorer, with more hunger, and upset about it. And what happens? The international community, as Joseph Stiglitz has just stated, hasn't fully understood what the situation is in mid-level countries, in mid-income countries. I should say that CAF Bank is a bank that attends or takes care to a great number of mid-income countries that will have reoriented their budgets to invest on the crisis. But that won't be enough. They'll have liquidity problems. They'll have more indebtedness. Some do have leeway to move about, but Central America, the Caribbean, doesn't have that financial ballroom. We are faced with the biggest crisis in history. Will have extreme poverty by 16 million people, will come to 83 million poor people. And the crisis, the healthcare crisis, how do we let it become a food crisis? And I'd like to say that we are hit on a productive and business structure with lots of weaknesses, with structural heterogeneity that has been terrible for the region. Because if you see the most affected sectors, where we are having a sector-wide analysis, what are the most affected sectors? Tourism, services. These are small companies, and we are seeing that 2.6 million companies, formal companies, will close in the region. This is what we are talking about, with lost income, with informality by 54%. Can you imagine that? We are talking about 2.6 million formal companies that will shut down. The majority are to small companies. So we are having the risk of a lost decade. We need to find a way out. I believe that the role of the bank is really important, and I hope that we do have an opportunity to talk about this later on in more detail. Thank you so much. It's concerning. This diagnosis is quite concerning. It leaves us moments to reflect upon what has been done in the region, but also based on what can be done moving forward. And so I'd like to ask Ángel Gurría what the OECD is doing in order to face the crisis. Thank you. First off, I'd like to say hello to Luis Carranza and to remember Enrique Garcia. He devoted almost half of his life to helping people. It's my pleasure to be here with Alicia and with Mr. Latin America, Mr. Enrique Iglesias. I was the chairperson of the promotion bank in Mexico. The Nacional Financiera was its name. It dealt with small to mid-sized companies, and I was then the general director and the chairman of the National Bank of Foreign Trade, that also devoted to small to mid-sized companies, to exporting. And then, as a Minister of Economy, I presided over all the boards of directories of all promotion institutes. And I would say that our countries in Latin America and the Caribbean in particular, development banks, the role of the promotion bank is absolutely fundamental. The promotion bank has to be strengthened. It has to be rationalized. It has to fulfill with many roles, many spaces that the market forces do not meet in our countries, and it covers many failures in the market. I should say that 20 years ago, Paul Volcker, on the part of countries, developed countries, and myself on the part of developing countries, invited us to have a discussion, a task force. We had lots of sessions, and we finally concluded on a document about what the best government model was like for financial international organizations. And towards the end of all that, all discussions, and from all over the world, there were experts of all sorts of types. The current editor of The Economist was one of them, Nancy Bertson, who was at the Institute for quite a long time. She was at Ibiza with Enrique Iglesias. And I should say that we all came down to the conclusion that the best government model was that by CAF. And we all had some sort of jealousy of the good type, and lots of desires to be governed by such a source as the one by CAF. Yesterday, we issued our projections. We are saying that Argentina will come down 8.3, Brazil 7.5, Mexico 7.5, Chile 6.5, but that is without a second wave. Without a second wave of the pandemic. That is to say, this is as long as we can dominate it and we can keep it, bringing it down, so that it eventually will disappear. Should there be a second wave, numbers are even worse. So we truly are at a very vulnerable moment. It is, I should say, a year of anniversaries. 50 years of CAF, 75 years of UN, United Nations, the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration on Women, 70 years of Maurice Schumann's Declaration for the European Construction, and 60 years having signed the OCDE Convention. So we all get together on this anniversary, and we all share the cake and the candles. I would say that we are in this difficult situation because we were having problems already, and all of a sudden COVID came along. We were having a slowdown problem with very low growth in the region. The region hadn't even grown on average. We were having problems with low prices on raw materials. We were having concentrated income problems. But on top of that, we were having very serious problems, very major problems of competitiveness, of productivity, of our economies. And then COVID came along. It never is good that an enemy such as this should appear, such lethal, with such a contagion power. But in the case of Latin America, I would say it came along at a tough moment. And not only did it take us by surprise, but it also showed how poorly prepared we were to meet the challenge. As Alicia stated, we are talking about countries that devote 2% to healthcare. Mexico My own country devotes 5.5%. On average, OECD is 9, and we've had some of 12, even down to 15. And let's talk about averages. We don't even come close to averages. This means that our shortfalls are really very big. And I should say that what we have done inter alia, additionally to working with countries individually, we have a digital platform on which today, at your disposal, we have 97 different pieces that our experts have carried out. So it's taxes and COVID, healthcare and COVID, vaccines and COVID, science and technology, and digital and COVID. So all is dedicated to COVID. Small and mid companies that are terribly endangered to a great extent, tourism and COVID. That is, in all cases, all that we do on a regular basis, well, is dedicated to COVID, and we invite you to take a look at that. As I say, there's almost 100 papers that were published on this. And in order to conclude, I should say that these efforts, these work structure that we are having, twice with Brazil, once with Colombia, once with Costa Rica, once with Peru, we are preparing with Mexico in order to share with them all the expertise that we have shared in all these topics. And we are ready to work with and for Latin America and the Caribbean. So please do count on us, do count on OECD. Thank you, Secretary. I will pass on to Mr. Enrique, based on the background that Bárcena and Gurria have given us. We were able to talk with some of the presidents in the region, and they all conclude that it would be impossible for a government, any government, to be ready for such a pandemic. They say it's a war from an invisible enemy. However, when we see previous crises, I'd like to ask you what the essence is, what the difference is, and how did it affect in a way that we haven't met before. So what are the main pillars in differences here? Well, I'd like to say hello first to our president, Mr. Carranza, and to congratulate him deeply on these 50 years where I joined from several perspectives. I'd like to say hello to the World and to the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF, on the way they have acquired a financial dimension in connection to financial markets, in connection to the country's presence in big initiatives. And I'd like to, as my friend Ángel Gurria said, I'd like to pay homage to 25 years of service. My big friend Enrique Garcia deserves this recognition. I'd like to salute this authentically Latin American initiative and the methodologies we look up to. This is a reality, and therefore I would like to congratulate you deeply on the 50th anniversary of this Latin American institution. In connection to your question, the current crisis is shaking up the foundations of the financial world and of the economic world, and considering the acceleration that we've had. I'm thinking about poverty, I'm thinking about the problems that are being generated with GDP. It's really terrible. We are talking about a wonderful drop that didn't take place in previous crises, not in this proportion. And we think that financial problems acquire a special dimension. Countries that have a Federal Reserve, the Bank of England or European banks, well, have very easy exits in financial terms, I mean. Our countries don't have any such a thing, and since they don't, they are resorting to the financial aid that is necessary to administer the crisis and to walk away from it. And development banks have become fashionable. Next week, this week, the government of Spain has summoned all presidents into a conversation on financial problems, and it summoned development banks. And I see that the government of France is summoning a meeting for all development banks to come out and meet the capacity to support that these institutions have in the current crisis. I'm really happy that there is some raising of awareness, and this is on the table. And then governments recognize that something needs to be done. The first thing that needs to be done is to give them more capital so that they can distribute. This should be done not in sacrificing the financial institution of countries, because they depend on the seriousness that countries will be regarded with. This doesn't have to be compromised. I should talk about 3 lessons to learn here. It has to do with the problems brought about by the current crisis, beyond the financial health. First off, the world is facing this breaking of the so-called multilateral relations. We are having some sort of regression that I hope it'll stop, but we know it can grow. In this environment, cooperation and regional integration acquires a new dimension that is even more important than in the past. I believe that we now have to think that among the new trends in the international community, we have to make the most of our capacity to do things together. CLAC was a pioneer in the field in 1960, launched a message. Today, the message in the crisis is really important because it is accompanied with this redeployment of the multilateral and this possibility of doing things together to keep surviving. The second, and it has to do a lot with CAF's experience, it's a bank that was very much focused on Latin America. I would say, secondly, the issue of technology. This was mentioned already. I believe that at the moment there is this digitalization being as one of the biggest instruments. A while ago, there was an article by another laureate, Nobel Economy. He said that the use and digitalization could transform 16 million small agricultural units in Latin America. So much poverty is focused here, agriculture, and there's other examples. So here there is a major challenge for regional banks to have an impact on this, to see how the new technologies can be put to the good use in order to improve productivity in these sectors that are so widely connected to poverty, extreme poverty in Latin America. The third one, we have started to take a look at the regional heritage that nature has given us, and this is the big support of Latin America. Climate change, we have to include policies of development banks in their full dimensions because it is unavoidable and it is fundamental so we can keep living on this planet. So all 3 dimensions are added to the enormous capital this institution has had over time, and they will be compromising it or committing it in Latin America through these channels and many others that I have just mentioned. We agree on the fact that it is a crisis, an unheard of crisis. We never had anyone such crisis like this before in the past. The numbers are complex. The numbers in the region are difficult. But even though it might sound a cliche, in times of crisis there are opportunities. And I would like to walk this path. What could this opportunity be so we can build interinstitutionality, social protection, so we can face future pandemics in a long-lasting manner? Because maybe what is being done so far can be to the midterm or to the short term until there's the cure available or a vaccine available. But what about the future? Your question is very relevant. I'd like to highlight that the role of the development, well, I cannot agree anymore with Don Enrique, as always is the case. Development banks are characterized by three features. They provide resources in a countercyclical manner, and this is quite important in highly uncertain environments. It takes care of segments in the population that are not covered by the private financial sector. And thirdly, they can help implement midterm development strategies. And here, this goes to your question. What do we want to do, and what is your suggestion? Our suggestion. It's 5 things. The first one, we definitely have to think that the future will be very different. This has been a total social fact that disrupted, that was most unexpected, and we cannot think even how science hasn't lived up to the standard. It's a different crisis. It doesn't only provide a crisis on the demand and on the supply. Solutions that are proposing are the ones that were proposed in 2008, while that was a banking crisis. This is not a banking crisis. We stopped our economic activity for fear of viruses. So, first off, what do we do in the short term? The first thing we are suggesting at ACLAC is to set in motion a basic emergency income for 6 months in order to cover poverty, that is, the income in the poorest homes. This is important to protect people. This basic income should be equivalent to one line of poverty, $140 a month. It would cost 2.1% of GDP. It's not all that much. Second, a temporary support to micro companies, small and mid-sized companies. Development banks have to open up a special window to reactivate and re-gear productive activities of companies. And that is where we think, first and foremost, how do we go about? We have to think about midterm and tax reforms. And together with Angel Gurria, he took part in this initiative by the General Secretary and the heads of states that have been summoned by the First Minister of Canada and Jamaica to think about solutions outside from the box in order to increase the tax base of countries. This is fundamental, and one of the things we need to do is to control tax funds, illicit funds, and a tax reform in the region where we pay a tax of 23%. It is very low. Second, developing a welfare system, a welfare mechanism. We have to take a bet on life, on education, nutrition. We do have to move on to that point. We need to avoid for economic impact to go deeper into inequalities or discriminating against women or other groups in the population. A big impulse, and this is where Luis Carranza will remain available to you to work on this. As Rothstein said after the Big Depression, he talked about that big impulse. In order for us to have sustainability, it should be based on new ways to produce, energy transition urgently, investing in digital structure, food safety strategies. How do we go about promoting urban mobility that should be more profitable or more sustainable? There are a number of sectors that we have identified. And fifth, the regional economic integration. What Don Enrique said, it is essential. We need to rethink regional integration to create these networks because the future economic geography will be different. Big companies are trying to look for resiliency rather than efficiency. They are going back to the United States or to Europe. They are moving away from fragmentation of value chains. So integration plays a key role. I know this will be my last intervention, and then I would say that CAF has to make bolder measures in order to be able to support these countries with mid-income that need this so badly, especially those with lower income, to have access at a low cost and to have low interest rates. We need to promote a future that will be less unequal. Our region is the most unequal region in the world, and inequalities continue to go deeper. So on my part, Andrea, I make a clack available to CAF. We've been helping one another for years. I do remember Enrique Garcia and the new leadership by Luis Carranza, so we can work together down to a better future. We take note of it because, no doubt, it is the moment of bringing ideas together on solidarity, getting together. Secretary, do we have any idea to make this long-lasting? No one will say that there won't be a future after the pandemic because, there will be more pandemics in the future and natural disasters. And how about the situation when we talk about forgiving debts from countries? The Pope talked about that. There are sectors in the world who are claiming this. How can we support our countries, the region where we are, when we have highly indebted countries and others who are a little bit more frail? Of course, there's a lot of talking of the walk, and before we can talk the walk, there's a long way we go. A very big problem was created because we are faced with the need where countries that have been benefited with this freezing of the debt servicing, the poorest countries in the world, many countries, including developing countries with a mid-level, as is the case with some in Latin America, they had to go to the Monetary Fund, World Bank, and other institutions to provide support. Countries in the Caribbean who depend so much on tourism, all of a sudden, their situation was frozen. They lost all income. There were no flights. Hotels were emptied. There was no demand on the services. All cruise lines had to go to their harbors. That is, as Alicia said, this is not a crisis resulting from the failure of any sector in particular that had an impact on all others. Here we decided to put economy on a hold in order for us to fight against the virus. And certainly so, I should say that this issue of having to pick between economy and life is it's a false dilemma. Because the most important thing is to win the battle as soon as possible, to throw against it all our efforts, all our resources, all possibilities, because the sooner we put an end to it, the sooner it is over, the cost of recovery will be smaller, and consequences in unemployment terms will also be smaller. What we are seeing here is something quite new. As the virus progresses, the impact that this is generating in terms of unemployment, in terms of small to mid-sized companies or even big companies, especially tourism and other service sectors, are being felt on the next day, immediately. And this is very high. It's brutal because the entire economic activity is halted. It's not just one sector or the affected sector. It's not just one bank. And authorities on top of that don't really know how much it'll cost. So all countries have package one, first responses, second package, second responses, third packages and third responses, and they all increase this. Units, at least so, in the more developed countries are no longer in the order of billions with a B, but rather trillions with a T. These are like billions of billions or millions of millions. We are talking about 10, 15, or 20% of GDP. We are talking about amounts which, among others, will make us talk about the debt. And when we want to take off, we'll find that our wings are kind of heavy, that we need to have a tarmac that will be longer for us. And we need to give more power to engines because the weight of debt by governments, by companies, and by households will hinder recovery or will make it a little bit more difficult. This is why recovery will have the shape of a U, especially in regions such as Latin America, rather than on a V. But I should say something about the debt or debt management. There are two problems to consider. First one, we need to have funding sources available, and at the same time, we need for there to be relief on how the debt is serviced. The problem being that we will be asking from the same people that they should no longer charge from us and that they should be lending more to us. And regularly, institutions, especially the private sector, say, if I went wrong or if something unheard of happened, then I won't be able to charge. I'll have to restructure the debt, as Joseph Stiglitz said, in connection to Argentina. We have a problem now with Ecuador, etc. The problem is that we need more resources. Not only does the debt servicing need more resources, current accounts were left without any income, so the deficit becomes very big. And so we have a very serious problem in that not only can we solve by helping the poorest countries, typically speaking African countries and some in Latin America, but we rather also have to have a more universal design in mind that will reach out to a greater number of countries, that will reflect the unique nature, the extraordinary nature, the exceptional nature of the problem we are being faced with. Thank you, Secretary. What about, Don Enrique, the shapes of international solidarity that we have to have in place to recover from the crisis? And what is the role institutions such as CAF have on it? What should countries have to learn? What is it that governments should learn? We should understand that development banks are more than a bank in themselves. They become advisors, they become friends, they share the anguish countries have. This is their big power, becoming a partner in how problems are managed. Second, so that there is greater activity and presence in countries, they need to have greater capital. That's the first thing, in order to truly be effective when increasing their lending capacity. The third thing is that this is reversed down to execution. We need to have solid institutions such as the ones we have right now. We sometimes have to be careful when we talk about this stuff because everyone asks for more milk, but then you have to take care of the cow that gives that milk. That is, there should be a financial structure that is permanently audited and controlled by international markets. And governments don't give any resources. They give them guarantees so that they indebt themselves in the market. But that should be the case every year, twice or three times a year. Those who measure financial markets to see how we lend or borrow. So the bank capacity grows bigger with the possibility of increasing the capital in the institution and in order to have access to markets. But that depends a lot on infrastructure. So this is why we need to have a central role. We need to have more resources on the part of governments, but at the same time, we need to keep a sound structure of institutions. This is the opinion of someone who was 18 years in the bank. So it is kind of reported on the common good of people, this being very important, and the current moment on the first line, actions against the crisis. We are left with 20 minutes. I'd like to invite our participants, if they write to at Agenda CAF or hashtag CAF50 so we can keep receiving questions. I have a few minutes to keep going with you. And then, when we have 15 minutes left, we can move on to the audience. Secretary, there's something that comes to my mind. You say money will be necessary, but there is something that is calling my attention on this pandemic, and something that is put on the table because it's always been there. Corruption. Pandemic and corruption. We need money, but then people steal the money that is needed for this pandemic. What is the formulation? I don't know whether there exists anyone. How do you see it from your own sectors in order to implement and in order to fight corruption? Because we manage nothing by placing money or by having tax reforms, and that our governments or signatories or politicians who manage hospitals or those who manage local governments should keep trying money. This is a very deep issue, a very important one, and I believe that it has to do with institutions getting strong and corruption and the culture of privilege. I'd like to talk about this a little. The culture of privilege our region is going through that makes inequalities natural, discrimination natural. It makes us see that what is happening is natural, and even corruption. And a way of corruption is tax avoidance or under invoicing of international trade. Governments should remain with those resources that are hardly being received. And what we need are governance, institutions with governance. I do concern with the fact that the state has had a leadership role, and this has been very important for the entire region. Our state is not authoritarian, it is democratic, where we just have temporary situations where people cannot go down to the street. And we need to have a social agreement, a political one, where every country will be looking for the main players that will have a role. The big losers are workers. That's what I'm concerned about. Collective bargaining agreements, companies. Some will disappear. 2.6 million small and mid-sized companies in the region will disappear. That's quite a lot. They are the ones that generate employment. But you are right on that. We need to move on to a system of governance, transparency, and accountability. We promoted an environmental agreement, the SCASUR agreement, access to information, justice, and citizenship participation. It might be a role that can be expanded onto other contexts, but we do need more transparent governments, open states, where citizens can supervise. Because after the crisis, we will be quite careful in seeing what they have done to suppress virus, to protect people. And this will be regarded. There is no other way around. And in some cases, we will have a strong judgment. And in corruption, the judgment will be quite dramatic for society. So I do believe that this is the way it goes. And I truly believe mechanisms should be in place that should be stronger and stronger to try and avoid problems against accountability. The last round, initially the Secretary, Alicia, talked about a region that will be upset. And this is some sort of driving force for the few election processes that will come along in the region in the next few months. What about the risk for this? What should be concerning us in terms of democracy? We cannot hear from his microphone. What about now? In connection to corruption, there's no one from any country that should be genetically more ethical than others. We do have controls and systems in place, and the peril that if you do something that is undue, you'll be punished or caught. So we need to work among systems altogether. We need to work on controls. We need to work in transparency in the bidding processes, where we generally have lots of corruption problems. And I say so just because not even in Japan or in Turkey or in Italy or in Mexico or in the United States or in England do we find any more of genetically ethical people or not. These are cultures based on systems. That's the difference, and this is where we need to work on. I mean, tax evasion that was mentioned. I want to say that there are more than 80 million bank accounts that have gotten transparent and that are in the hands of tax readers in every country. And there are 100 countries that are exchanging information. So in Turkey, all Turks are depositing their money. And, well, Italians and Mexicans and all along. So that is already happening. It's trillions. The same amounts we have assigned to COVID. This is very important from the side of transparency and from the side of confidence and reliance, because if people believe or feel that there are privileged people, as Alicia was saying, who can take money from their country and send it over to a financial center where they don't have to pay any taxes. And in the meantime, these are small and medium-sized companies, and they are trapped in their own borders, so they need to be subjected to controls. And big companies don't pay, and then small and medium-sized companies have to abide by controls. So there is this discomfort reaction. And we see what happens in Latin America with discomfort, because before COVID, what we used to have was a situation where there were flames of discomfort in several of the countries. And we had this at a moment that happened in a generalized manner, with very few exceptions. That is precisely so, because in what used to look like some recovery, we left many people out. We left lots of people that were not in the framework, that were not on the boat set sailing with the others. They were in a disadvantaged situation. We are talking about healthcare. We are talking about education, about skills, abilities, and competencies, the skill sets. We are talking about the quality, the pay for what we work. So the issue of those that are outraged, well, they really cause our democracies to be in terrible danger. And so people may say, let's go for a change. Let's go for change. And all of a sudden, they don't necessarily make any reflections or any sound decisions. They don't impact on consequences. And then the results, of course, are short of sensible. It's quite serious. It's quite delicate. And this is one of the issues. And if on top of that we add the problem with pandemics, of course, there will be ever more reasons for us to have this kind of dissatisfaction, the consequences of which we have already seen. I take questions from the audience. They are highly interested, and I'd like to ask them all. To Mr. Iglesias, well, let's go back to the debt, how to rethink about the growth of our countries in the region when almost all countries are indebted. How do we manage that debt? Countries that have been indebted, low-income countries, in the 1980s and 1990s, some sort of relief was enabled. Now, countries that have greater capacity, well, there are more terms to be honored, conditions to borrow at different rates. So we have to analyze this on a country-by-country basis. In Latin America and in the rest of the world, we do have a number of experiences. Some of them were those countries that have more debt are considering, we consider them as forgiving the debt from them. From Curtis Williams, Secretary, what are the Caribbean economies waiting for, considering the collapse of tourism in Caribbean countries? You mentioned this. That's a very important question. We work very closely with the Caribbean economies. They have been very hard hit because tourism went down. The drop of remittances, they are going through one of the most complex situations. These are highly indebted countries. And in the case of Caribbean countries, we analyzed why is it that Caribbean countries have borrowed debt in history. It's not just because they haven't managed their public finances well enough. They have also been very much hit by natural disasters. They sometimes have to rebuild after hurricanes hit. We are in the middle of a hurricane season. For the Caribbean, the international community joins us at ACLAC, and we are asking for relief. G20 has granted debt relief to countries with lower income. This has been evaluated. Private creditors are taking a look at that. Countries in the Caribbean should be dealt with in a special way, and some concessional funds should be granted. They should be relieved on the payment of interests so that this can be an aid to them. Paying interests on the public debt of the central government is 6.2% of GDP a year. International community, if it had access to forgiving or at least so postponing these interests for the rest of 2020 and maybe reduce debt in the Caribbean and some insular states that have been terribly affected, who have no options. Well, this is being studied. We are analyzing this. I'd like to approach another issue to reactivate liquidity in the region. We are proposing seriously that the IMF should provide special rights for remittances. This give liquidity, or for overdrafts, that give more liquidity to economies, especially in emerging economies. And that is something worth mentioning because it is truly important. And in the Caribbean, what needs to be done? Well, that is where we are going deeper into the food crisis, the climate and the hydrate crisis. In the Caribbean, it is urgent to potentiate the way out based on solutions based on nature, the economy of oceans that we are exploring quite deeply together with them, and I should say renewable energy, so they don't have to import energy as is the case today, and so they can empower food safety that is or food security that is so dramatically impacted. More questions that get to at Agenda CAF. I'd like to go to Guria. What about the perspectives of investments in infrastructure post-COVID-19? We have lots of opportunities there because they existed already. Take a look at what is happening. Education, healthcare, skills, good governance, the fight against corruption, transparency, infrastructure. Did it happen because of COVID? Of course not. They were already in place. The thing is that COVID has turned this so evident and so emergent. It's not just urgent, but evident. deficit in Latin America, the big deficit in Latin America, including integration, a minimal part of trade in the region is done within the region. The case of Europe, for instance, almost 2/3 of European trade is done with Europe, for starters. So we have a situation where those deficits have become more evident. When we discussed about infrastructure, let's think about how we can build again, but in a better manner, and how we can make everything more resilient. It's a term that I've been using lately because now everything has to be resilient, inclusive and green. Let's not forget that in spite of the pandemic, the responsibility, the intergenerational responsibility, the most important one, continues to be that of protecting and preserving the planet. Please, let's not get distracted with the attention that we are necessarily paying to COVID. Infrastructure has always been our shortfall, our shortcoming. We are talking about ports and airports, roads, bridges, railways, and the soft infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, infrastructure of knowledge, being something that we unavoidably should be moving on to. Nonetheless, we are short on that. So the possibilities to work together, meaning private and public sectors, in infrastructure are almost infinite. Don Enrique, this is another challenge, that of education. In the current situation, how do you see education and virtual education? Many countries are finishing the school year and others are beginning the school year, and they say, well, it's a lost year in terms of education. These can be taken from two levels. The issues this year are quite complex, and they will be solved on an ad hoc basis in different places. We have to focus on one of the most important issues that we have ahead of us, getting people ready to leave the state of poverty behind so they can meet the new challenges and develop in the future. Getting people ready to coexist. And this is really part of the basic structures in primary education. Education is the element that will allow us to face the world that will remain after COVID-19. And we have to make such a big effort when it comes to that. Lots of things have been done. When I went to university lots of decades ago, in Latin America, there were 250,000 university students. Today, we have 30 million. So things have been done about that, but we need to do more. I think education at all levels. It's not just education of children and young people. It's also a matter of using the capital of the elderly. I represent them here, and this is already 20%, people over 65, who have a resource. Everything has to be put in motion, and this is done so with education, with political initiatives, and with the capacity of raise awareness among people to live better in company of those that they need to share this with. Alicia, did you want to add anything onto virtual education? But I'll ask something to Luis Cabrera. What's the relevance of civil society when rebuilding economies? Thank you so much, Andrea. The digital divide is really very wide in our region. We have calculated that 20% of the 165 million children and teenagers have no access to remote education. They might have access to internet on the mobiles of their mothers, but they cannot download educational material. That's quite a big gap. What about the new challenges of education? Digital education, coexistence. I do believe that we need to add the culture of equality, environmental sustainability, ecological culture, cultural diversity, solidarity, new values, intergenerational values, because our pandemic is a public problem, as is public climate change. And it will hit us very hard. And we need to undertake the environmental causes of pandemic. The big losers in pandemic today are the assumptions of environmental sectors and the budget granted to them. I'm really concerned at having a shortcoming on the budgets in the institutions that could help us a lot in defending ecosystems. Deforestation in our region last year reached the equivalent of the size of the entire Venezuela. So we have come down to the 9 planetary limits. So we need to come to terms and be ready for this big challenge. And solutions based on nature are truly very important. And that is where I go to civil society. A very important part of civil society has expressed that there should be a civilization agenda that is a very important one. Agendas for women. The feminist movement has been one of the most powerful movements to provide equality, the equality of sexual diversity and that of women. That is so necessary. And that is a result of the civil society. Ecology is a result of civil society. Escazú agreement being a citizen agreement where civil society was the creator of this big agreement. So we are faced with these civilization crossroads. We have to overcome this predator civilization to bestow well-being to population. And in that equation, we need a new one between the state, the market, and society. So we can have a society that will truly represent citizens. We need civil societies to play a very important role. Before this meeting, I was in a meeting of the civil society of Latin America and the Caribbean, talking about how they are contributing in the crisis, how popular soup kitchens are contributing, how they are coming down to the populations who live in a very crowded situation. Healthcare assistance is getting to their hands very actively. So civil society plays an important, essential role because it helps achieve transparency. It helps in accountability, but we need one that should be informed, that should stay active, and that should engage in proposals. This is as far as we need to reach. And civil society, in my case, I fully agree with the fact that it has given us an open spirit, an open culture in many senses. And I say so in civil society, being in the cultural topics of Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, they are making so many contributions in drama, in music, in cinema, and that has a lot of civil society. So, Andrea, I think that this new thing is essential, the new agreement between the state, the market, and society. Thank you, Madam Secretary. We had lots of questions. I apologize. I won't be able to ask them all. I just wanted to give priority to the ones that have arrived first. So the last for you, Secretary, I'd like to keep going for a long time, but Nubia Alava, reducing gender inequalities is a challenge, as Alicia was saying. So what are the opportunities that we have currently in the situation? This is a battle that has been going on for long years, and we need to keep insisting because it never will end. There will always be new manifestations of inequality. We've gone a long way. G20 6 years ago declared that all countries would work so that by 2025, the difference of the participation between men and women, or the share between men and women in the market, would be reduced by 25%. I mean, the difference would be reduced by only 25%, and this gives you an indication of how difficult it is to make progress. With Alicia, my co-citizen, she's a witness in Mexico. Half of the legislators are women, but that required legislation. It didn't happen naturally. It had to be imposed. It didn't happen spontaneously. Civil society plays a very important role in order for us to remember this. Pay gaps, the gap between paying for an equal job between men and women, 15 or 20%, and opportunities play an important role, this being fundamental. Because of pandemics, we are seeing this dramatic case where women, 75% of people on the front line against pandemic are women. Nurses, paramedics, doctors, all of them being women, and they have to be mothers. And since we confine children, they have to balance things out. In many cases, they are single mothers. They are household winners or breadwinners. And at the same time, we do have a very serious problem in that a country such as mine, with a higher relative development, there's resistance among social groups and women who came back to society to join because supposedly they brought the virus with themselves. They had been saving lives the entire day and balancing things and juggling things at the same time. And at the same time, people would be aggressive with them or would attack them because supposedly they would bring the virus with themselves. And attacks were far more present against women, nurses and doctors. And what happened during the lockdown? 30% of violence on the part of spouses, that is the husband, the boyfriend, the closer person there, or any member of the family. We've seen the best of humanity and the worst of humanity at this point. People that have become, rich, selling face masks as if they were golden face masks. But, the issue with women is a fundamental one. We need to keep working with women. And in many cases, this has to be legislated. The problem being the following. There is no sufficiently progressing with the will, not even with a very clear leadership in illustrated leaders. There is no progressing. In many cases, it has to be legislated, as is the case with women in the administration councils of companies. All of that has been possible, but in countries such as Norway or in countries such as Germany, it's been possible with a legislation in the middle. In countries where the discrimination against women is so highly stressed or underscored, as is the case in Latin America. I've been told I can give you 1 minute each of you for a final reflection. Let's get started with Mr. Enrique. All these crises have a very high cost that is quite regrettable, but it brings opportunities as well. The reflections we have heard today are open, and I should say that they encourage reaction. The worst thing that could happen is to tell people that it's only a tragedy, without saying that this is the moment where creativity, trust, solidarity, cooperation between the state, the private sector, and the civil society should really be promoting things. The solidarity we've seen today, helping people. This is a demonstration that in society there are conditions to react. And how the lockdown was specifically and disciplinarily accepted by most people. It's important to meet the problems, but there is a capacity as well. Not to succumb in pessimism or inaction. We need to fight, and that struggle will pay off a good result. Thank you. I fully agree. Our vision should be a positive one. This brings about a unique opportunity, a window of change, new airs that make us think. Learning lessons from the crisis will be very relevant. We are emerging from this crisis as different people, as better people, as a better society with more solidarity that should be capable to understand that public goods are essential and we all need to work providing public goods. And one of those public goods, from my point of view, is to have climate security, food security, and security on healthcare, these being very important public goods, and the society has to come to an agreement, to have a big agreement, a social political agreement, an intergenerational agreement to promote deep and long-lasting change so that we don't have this concentrating model that has concentrated wealth so much and that has caused so much suffering. Thank you. Let's now go to the General Secretary. Let me give you an example of something that is happening here in France, where we have the seat of OCDE. The government said we need to revive the auto industry. We'll give subsidies and grants so people can buy cars. But they give 3 times as much to those buying electric cars, or twice as much to those buying hybrid cars, and just a little if they are willing to buy cars that issue or that emit toxic gases. This is an example of how public resources can be put to use in order to reshape the future. Just so, the post-COVID time will not only help us go back to normal, because normal, was it all that good? Because it brought us to what we are now. So we should go to a normal that should be better than the normal before, having effectively learned the lessons that this crisis has brought about. And approaching us, or making us approach these issues that we needed, that we knew we had to approach. The best thing that could ever happen is to recover the sense of urgency, the sense of emergency, and remembering that our responsibilities are first and foremost with our people, with their well-being, but also, I should say again, that we need to take care of the planet that will be bestowing on to our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your reflections. Thank you for being so positive, considering the tough situation we will be living through. We can hear virtual applauses of those who are with us. Thank you so much. That was very kind of you. I'll give the floor to Luis Carranza, so he will address us with his closing remarks. Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to thank Alicia, Angel, and Enrique in special, for these remarkable reflections in such a critical moment for the region. I'd like to make a few brief comments, especially on CAF's role. Thanks to the strengthening of the net worth in the last few years, as Enrique said, keeping our cow healthy so it could milk well, we've had a very definite response to the crisis. This year we will more than double the disbursements to central governments so they can face the financial needs. We have a record approval of more than $16 million. At the same time, we've had a major effort placed on directing lines of credit to development banks in our countries, with a focus on small to mid companies. On Tuesday, in our board of directors, a $1.6 billion line of credit that will extend quickly has been approved. And this is part of our strategy of focusing on the Latin American SME, trying for them to become international, to innovate and to integrate productive chains. Secondly, I'd like to talk about how important is the commitment we have with the environment, as has been expressed by our three distinguished panel members. This is fundamental, but this is not just so through our credits, but also as a true conviction. As part of our organization, we have estimated by an independent agency what the impact we had was in the environment, the production of greenhouse gases, and our decision was to compensate or to offset our carbon footprint since we started our operations. We started our 50th anniversary being carbon neutral. The third point is that even though it is true that there are a few critical things in Latin America, there also are very worth noting examples. Digitalization in Uruguay, the example of wine industry in Argentina and Chile, the big effort in Bolivia to have infrastructure in the rural field, programs Mi Agua, Mi Riego, My Water, My Irrigation, Paraguay, and its integration through Trans-Chaco, the bridge on the triple border area, and efforts on electrical energy, Colombia and their efforts around orange technology, Panama, joining logistics with excellence, major industries in Ecuador, in spite of how difficult it is for them to be in a dollarized economy, they have grown in productivity, or agro-industry in Peru. In almost all of our countries, we have excellence examples. They are a matter of us being proud and hopeful. And finally, I agree with the three panel members. We require greater cooperation and greater collaboration with one another, that is, with Latin American people, but also with the global community. In conversations with chair people in member countries of CAF or with ministers of economy, we've seen how convenient it was to put together a fund in order to fund infrastructure for integration and digitally. The fund would be created with the support of developed countries, and they would offer guarantees to emit or to issue bonds. The cost at which developed countries are funded for the very long term, and this would help us see to the challenge of infrastructure in a final manner. This being an effort that we hope can get consolidated in the next few months, and it basically is the Latin American desire to finally reduce the divide, the digital divide. I'd like to conclude by thanking you, Andrea, and all the attendees to this virtual conference for having joined us in our 50th anniversary. Thank you very much, Mr. Luis Carranza Ugarte, for your remarks. A virtual applause to all of you. On behalf of CAF, the Bank of Development of Latin America, I thank all our guests. You've taken the time to join us from your tablets, computers, mobiles, who have joined this virtual meeting. Another recognition to the media partners, El País GBA, La Nación, El Tiempo Globo, El Comercio from Peru and Ecuador, El País from Uruguay, El Universal, El Nacional, La Nación, Graphic Press, La Prensa, New Day, America Economy, La Razón, 5 Days, and The Guardian, and La Prensa from our local place. Thank you all. It's been my pleasure, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a great day. Thank you.